The Second Battle of Ypres, Part 2, St. Julien. Continuation from April 23rd to April 25th. April 23rd. The village of St. Julien, now called Saint Julien, was in the rear of the 1st Canadian Division until the poison gas attack of April 22nd, when it became the front line. Some of the first fighting in the village involved the stand of Lance Corporal Frederick Fisher of the 13th Battalion's CEF's machine gun detachment. Fisher went out twice with a handful of men and a Colt machine gun, preventing advancing German troops from passing through St. Julien into the rear of the Canadian front line. He was killed the following day. Most of the Canadian infantrymen had now gone a full day without sleep. They had suffered under the strain of constant shell and small arms fire, bursts of adrenaline and terror, and a lack of food and water. On the left flank, only 12 Canadian and 4 Zouave companies covered about 12,000 meters of front. The 13th Battalion still hold the key left shoulder of the Canadian line and had spent the night repelling attacks from the front, side, and even the rear. British and French artillery support came from the other side of the canal, but all along the front the Canadians were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. All of the remaining Canadian Reserve battalions were ordered into the line, as well as several British battalions formed into an ad hoc force known as the Geddes Detachment, which filled the gap between Kitchener's Wood and Mauser Ridge. Colonel Geddes of the Buffs was given a brigade. That consisted of the 2nd Buffs, 3rd Middlesex, 5th King's Own, and 1st York and Lancaster. This was supposedly about 4,000 men, but this number was probably not up to that strength. 2 companies of the 3rd Middlesex were also detached to guard the Yser Bridge near Briley. Here is some information about these units. This formation fought heroically throughout the day, beating back several German attacks and ensuring that the Canadians further to the right around St. Julien were not enveloped. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions had moved forward across the canal at midnight on April 22nd. Behind them, throngs of refugees streamed from the burning city of Ypres. Charred bodies lay strewn in the streets and along the side of the road. The air was black with smoke, but lit eerily by the flames, shellfire, and flares. As the Canadian Reserve units from the 1st Brigade pushed into the maelstrom, the Germans shelled them, pounding bridges and roads in the hope of slowing this support force. Private R.J. Clark of the 3rd Battalion said, "I saw at least 20 men of the battalion killed on the main road by shrapnel." He was wounded too, only hours later. While the entire front was under fire, Hellfire Corner, an infamous intersection on the Menin Road, which led out of Ypres, became famous for its danger. No one lingered there, and even the corpses were soon blasted out of existence by the never-ending shellfire. Brigadier Turner had been told about the successful but costly attack against the Germans in Kitchener's Wood by an officer who gave him a hastily scribbled message in the middle of the night. The officer that gave him the message staggered into the dugout, handing over the blood-splattered note, but could say very little, as a bullet had ripped out his throat and shattered his chin. The situation had stabilized, but was still precarious. No one was sure what the morning would bring. Under these conditions, Turner sent an urgent plea to Currie to send whatever reinforcements he had left to fill the gap north of his command post at St. Julien. This was not an unreasonable request, since Currie's forces had not yet been attacked, even though the brigadier thought that it was only a matter of time until they were. Aware that the battle center was on the left flank, around Kitchener's Wood, Currie ordered the last of his reserves, 3 companies of the 7th Battalion, to strengthen Turner's line. While the Canadian-held front at Ypres appears small on most maps, Currie's men had to run and dodge across 1,000 meters of broken ground with full kit. The British Columbians from the 7th Battalion made their way crouched over, harassed in the gloom by German shell and shot. Platoons and sections got mixed up, but Currie's force arrived to strengthen Turner's front. A senior officer in the 7th Battalion, Major Victor Odlum, a wealthy Victoria newspaperman and experienced militia officer who had served in the South African War as a private, played a key role in establishing the forward defense at the essential post at St. Julien that day. Years after the war, he told about seeing his younger brother running towards the front later in the day, carrying desperately needed ammunition. By chances, their eyes met. They waved to each other, and seconds later he saw his brother Joseph atomized by a direct hit from a shell. Odlum bit back his tears and continued to oversee the desperate defense. Later, in the same battle, Odlum's cousin would be killed, as would his friend and commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel William Hart McCarg, who was shot through the stomach as he and Odlum were checking up the front. Odlum and his men were fortified around Kearslayer, which was south of the 13th Battalion and north of St. Julien, at around 3 a.m. on April 23rd. The 7th Battalion's infantrymen were ready to repel further advances expected the next day, and they later helped to support the 13th as its surviving officers pulled back from exposed lines to a more secure position closer to St. Julien. With his front stabilized by the early hours of April 23rd, Turner ordered Lieutenant Colonel David Watson's 2nd Battalion to support the 10th and 16th to allow their vulnerable and overextended survivors to get back to the Canadian trenches from their position in the southern edge of Kitchener's Wood, where they had moved to better defend against enemy shell fire. These battalions' ever-dwindling numbers were depressing and shocking. Private Sidney Cox of the 10th remembered sergeants ordering the men to sound off in numbers as they were spread throughout the wood in many shell craters and so not visible to each other. Every time you numbered, you were a lower number than you were the time before. You didn't feel so good about that. Lieutenant Hugh Urquhart of the 16th Battalion, who would later rise to command a battalion before being maimed by a terrible wound through the spine, wrote, "When dawn at last broke, we found the German trench almost enfilading us. I looked at my wristwatch, thinking it must be noon. The minutes seemed long. But it was only 6:30 a.m. Looking backwards, we could see our dead lying over the field, and the terribleness of last night's work came home to us." Many of the Canadians had been killed almost immediately or succumbed to their wounds. Others were badly wounded and in agonizing pain. When the stretcher bearers tried to help them in the open ground, German snipers fired at them. As the remains of the counterattacking force dug in to the hard earth, attempting to expand their trenches, the German artillery opened up. Urquhart wrote, "One shell blew some men out of the trench. One shell burst overhead. The shock seemed to kill the men, for there was no scratch on them. In other cases, soldiers were literally blown to pieces, the bodies shredded by the force of the explosion, flesh reduced to pulp, the remains shoveled into a sandbag or left smeared in the mud. The shattered remnants of the 2 battalions clung to Kitchener's Wood, after hastily fortifying their shell-crater defenses and shallow trenches." Urquhart wrote, "At a certain stage of the game, one officer in a trench on our right seemed to go literally crazy, shouted ridiculous fire orders, and kept passing information which we knew to be wrong. We endeavored to stop his shouting, but without avail. Much to our relief, he got wounded." The strain of the battle was terrible, but help was coming. In the early morning of April 23rd, the 2nd Battalion was rushed to the front to dig in along the southeast edge of Kitchener's Wood and relieve what was left of the 10th and 16th Battalions. Officers and patrols who were sent out to recce the battlefield disappeared after the sounds of heavy gunfire, an ominous sign. Nonetheless, a company from the 2nd Battalion was ordered forward in another clumsy attack. They advanced under the cover of a heavy mist, and, before dawn's first light, about halfway to the wood, the mist suddenly evaporated, leaving the company of 200 men vulnerable on the open ground. Surprised, Germans quickly opened fire. Private Alfred Baggs of the 2nd Battalion gives a vivid account of his private battle during 2 days of fighting. The rifle and machine gun fire was so severe that it was quite impossible for the men who were not hit to make any further headway without getting wiped out. Consequently, they were ordered to retire. We dug in with almost no cover. You may believe me that we dug that trench as fast as it was possible. A few rescue parties tried to pull in the wounded, but the Germans killed many by keeping up heavy fire on us. As the sun rose on April 23rd, Baggs's platoon was ordered to reinforce the ravaged front trench held by the reduced forces of the 10th and 16th Battalions, again going forward across a killing zone. To get there, they had to travel 100 meters in the open, with only knee-high mustard grass as cover, all the while advancing towards the enemy lines. Not knowing where they were headed and unable to look around without drawing fire, many of the Canadians crawled in circles. Baggs kept coming upon dead and wounded Canadians, the wounded trying to crawl back to the rear, but were hopelessly lost. He finally got his bearings by tracking the sun and following blood trails through the crushed mustard grass. When Baggs came to the edge of the grass, he was horrified to find a gap of about 15 meters of open ground between his platoon's position and the Canadian front line. And so the Canadians rested at the edge, caught their breath, and, as Baggs noted in his diary, made a dash for it. They passed the bodies of their companions in their desperate sprint. Baggs dove headfirst into the shallow ditch in Kitchener's Wood. the bullets kicking up dirt behind him. Looking around at exhausted and bloody survivors, he realized that the new Canadian trenches he had just risked his life to fortify were overextended and enfiladed. After 2 hours of trading fire with the enemy, massing German troops forced the Canadians to pull back. And that meant braving the gap again. This time, the Germans had a machine gun and sniped at the Canadians who ran back one at a time. They queued up in a line of death, men quietly saying goodbye to one another, aware that their chances were slim, but those behind them had it worse, as they would only get their turn to run after the enemy had been alerted to the action. Several of Baggs's exhausted friends, men he had trained with for months, were killed around him. When Baggs's turn came to run, he was so demoralized and dispirited after the rush and fall of adrenaline that he could not find the energy to run the whole way, even as light artillery shells were added to the small arms and machine gun fire directed against him. Panting and sweating, he walked the final few meters into the mustard grass. His back and shoulder hunched in tension, as he expected a bullet through the spine every step he took. He somehow survived, a testament to the chanciness of war. No doubt, he looked at the shamrock tattoo on his left wrist a few times during the day and wondered how long his luck could last. His luck would in fact last for the entire war, although he was later shell-shocked on the Somme. Despite the annihilation of Baggs's company, 2 other 2nd Battalion companies had captured key positions that strengthened the Canadian line south of Kitchener's Wood and to the east. Here, the machine gunners and riflemen of 5 platoons, situated in 2 strongpoints known as Hooper's House and Doxey's House, held the Germans at bay. With wide and unobstructed fields of fire, the Canadian infantrymen cut the enemy to ribbons. Sergeant H.C. Ablard, one of the 2nd Battalion's best marksmen, climbed into the 2nd story of the ruined Doxey's house and shot down at least 18 enemy troops before he too was shot. The garrison here held on until April 24th, when they were finally overwhelmed by fire and by enemy troops after St. Julien fell on their right flank. However, by noon on April 23rd, the Canadians had dug a string of defensive trenches, linked in part by manned shell holes, creating a nearly continuous line to protect against German probing attacks coming from the vicinity of Kitchener's Wood. While most of the surviving Canadian troops, numbering about 14,000 men, were now committed to battle, the defense was very much an engagement of small groups of enlisted men separated from their officers. The 4 Colt machine guns per battalion provided essential firepower, but the Canadians found themselves in a desperate battle to the finish, with both their rifles and machine guns jamming. Despite their fending off of German assaults, the enemy weight of return fire was increasing, with deadly accurate artillery shells raining down on the front and rear positions. One Canadian wrote, "When the German guns open fire on you, all you can do is sit tight and hope to God a shell does not drop in the trench." Losses began to mount, but the hard-as-nails Canadians would not be easily dislodged. It was a gut-wrenching time for all, however, as the remaining Canadian reserves were thrown into the line. Losses were heavy. Lieutenant Colonel David Watson of the 2nd Battalion, who was the 46-year-old manager of the Quebec City Chronicle, had time to reflect on his unit's first 2 days in battle, confessing to his diary, My God, what an awful night we had. But still the Canadians fought on, defending key positions like St. Julien and defeating a new series of German attacks. Infiltrating German parties, heavy artillery fire that cut communication lines, and the normal friction of battle had left Currie out of touch with Turner's 3rd Brigade Command headquarters. But the fact that the 3rd Brigade's artillery batteries were pulling back along the front was a grim signal that the brigade was in trouble. Currie's forces still held the apex of the original line, but the brigadier was preparing a second strongpoint at Locality C, a shallow trench running along the skyline at the eastern end of Gravenstaffel Ridge, roughly 900 meters behind the front line held by his 8th and 5th battalions. It offered good fields of fire and could be a strong forming up position, either for a counterattack or as a secondary line of defense. By the end of April 23rd, the Canadian held front had stabilized, but General Alderson's divisional headquarters, situated behind the Yser Canal, had lost control of the battle. The British had begun to feed battalions and brigades piecemeal into the salient, but these troops often received orders from Alderson or other British divisional headquarters to carry out desperate attacks over open ground in broad daylight without proper reconnaissance. Several British battalions were shattered in their doomed attempt to follow such incompetent orders. With almost no centralized command, individual Canadian battalions, companies, and platoons held out as best they could. The fighting on April 22nd had been controlled by the brigadiers, but they had lost touch with their units once the reserves were committed to holding the line. The fighting on April 23rd was therefore a battalion commander's battle, with most units fighting in isolation, cut off by sweeping fire and severed communications. The training they had undergone in England, including months of discipline and drill, helped exhausted warriors deal with the stress and confusion on the battlefield. But breaks and fissures erupted throughout units as men cracked under the strain of stress. In some of the fiercest fighting, Lieutenant Colonel George Tuxford of the 5th Battalion, a 45-year-old Welsh-born farmer and cowboy from South Saskatchewan, who was a legend among Westerners for leading the longest cattle drive in history from his farm in Saskatchewan across the Rockies, issued orders that any man attempting to retreat was to be shot. While his soldiers received no food during the last 2 days, most of the men did not need the motivation of such threats and fought to the bitter end. By darkness on April 23rd, most had not slept for 48 hours. During the lulls in the battle, wasted men crumpled forward, sometimes sleeping on their feet or face first in the dirt. They were difficult to distinguish from the dead. Officers sacrificed their own much-needed rest to crawl around no man's land, searching for signs of impending attack, and gathering ammunition and water bottles from the fallen. Lieutenant William Johnson wrote to his wife, "I began to get jumpy from the constant strain on my nerves and want of sleep, but everybody was the same." The sleep-deprived Dominion troops tried to snatch a few hours of rest, but weary sentries called the men to stand to almost every hour to protect against real and imaginary German attacks. Even with the front stabilized, hundreds of wounded lay bleeding in the lines. Those who could drag themselves out of the craters stumbled to the rear or were assisted by other walking wounded. Through the clouds of cordite that hung over the battlefield, the instinct to survive drove men to pull themselves back along the shell-cratered road with broken legs, or to stumble to the rear while cradling bloody stumps where once hands had been. One horrified medical officer wrote, "I myself once saw a man run down a road on the exposed ends of his tibia and fibula, flinging aside with each step the torn remains of his foot, attached to his leg by a few tendons." Dressing stations were inundated with hundreds of men at a time. The conventional wounds were terrible. The internal gas wounds were even worse. The chlorine irritated and destroyed the alveoli, causing fluid discharge within the lungs and impairing the exchange of oxygen. Even worse, the chlorine mixed with water to form hydrochloric acid that burned tissue. In the end, men drowned in their own searing fluids. It was an ugly death. Victims writhed on the ground, making gagging, choking sounds, pulling at their clothes, vomiting greenish slime, propping themselves up to gasp for help, and then falling back, exhausted from their struggles. One Canadian described the ghastly fate of a gasped companion. The wheezing and frothing from his mouth, like that of a horribly bloated bullfrog, the dilated eyeballs, the pond scum green discoloration of the face and neck, and the gurgling sound issuing from his throat, ironically simulating the hissing of escaping gas cylinders. The worst cases of gassing were untreatable. Overwhelmed medical units did their best to administer morphine or alcohol to the terrified men who were slowly suffocating. Tragically, the victims often remained conscious up to the last minutes of their lives. As bad as the gas wounds were, far more men were killed by conventional weapons. Hundreds and then thousands passed through the advanced dressing stations, where surgeons, stretcher bearers, and medical officers did their best to comfort and care for the wounded. A cigarette, a sip of water, and a comforting word could soothe the man as he waited in line to have his blood-soaked bandages changed. Captain P.G. Bell of No. 3 Field Ambulance wrote, "We have had all varieties of wounds, some bad fractures, etc., with shrapnel, relatively few heads, chests, or abdomens. I suppose they haven't survived. Many wounds to the face, noses shot away, bullets in ears, but only 3 or 4 men with eyes destroyed." Among the dead and dying at a dressing station, who were often laid out under the fall of shells as they waited for treatment, shell-shocked men cried, trembled, or simply stared with vacant, haunted eyes. The unending and nearly inhuman stress of battle had broken the minds of men, just as the shells and bullets had shattered bodies. Captain Francis Scrimger, a thin, 34-year-old surgeon who wore glasses, who worked with the 13th Battalion, who would later be awarded the Victoria Cross for his bravery in caring for wounded in the front lines, described in his diary a man who was deaf and dumb and quite insane and babbling as a result of the shell fire. He was not wounded. 2 officers went temporarily insane from loss of sleep, anxiety, and the nervous strain of constant big shells. A 3rd was on the verge of similar conditions. Scrimger who would work on repairing the shredded flesh of his fellow Canadians, legs and arms crushed and heads torn open, also felt himself losing control by the end of the second day, and suffering almost unbearable anxiety as the shells exploded around him and his patients. But he did not break and continued to tend to the injured men. Few would have suspected before the war that ordinary men like Scrimger, men seemingly far from filling the mold of the ideal hero, would rise to the occasion under such terrible strain. But most of the Canadians did, and their quiet heroics staved off defeat at Ypres. April 24th. Private Harold Pete of the Dirty Third watched the blur of shells skimming over his shallow trench all day on April 23rd and 24th. Some of the shells traveled so low that several times his cap was pulled from his head, and the enormous atmospheric pressure from one high-caliber shell nearly pulled him entirely out of the trench when it roared over him. While many of these shells obliterated his comrades in arms, Pete survived the battle, though the shrapnel he took in the back and shoulder knocked him out of the war. But that was not a bad result for Pete, as he met his future wife while recovering in England, and then returned to Canada to write his memoirs, which became the subject of a Hollywood film, in which he starred as himself. In the early morning hours of April 24th, the 5th, 8th, 13th, and 15th Battalions still held much of the original front lines, but they were at the far end of a new, narrow divisional front that had been caved in from the German pressure coming from the north of the salient. These 4 battalions had spent the last 2 days strengthening their positions with barbed wire and sandbags. Overlapping fields of fire were established by digging new slit trenches, expanding shell craters, and positioning Colt machine guns to rake the battlefield. The Canadian garrisons also defeated probing German attacks, especially on the far left, still held grimly by the 13th Battalion, now supported by the 7th and 14th Battalions, with the 2nd, 3rd, 10th, and 16th in a jumble to the south of Kitchener's Wood. Further to the west, the 1st and 4th Battalions were dug in and better supported by British troops. Having suffered severe losses, the Canadians now had 12 weakened battalions, facing about 24 German battalions. All knew a massed enemy assault was not long in coming. At 4 a.m. on April 24th, the Canadians fell victim to the second chlorine gas attack in the history of warfare, accompanied by an intense 10-minute artillery bombardment that shattered many of the Canadian trenches. The survivors pulled themselves out of the smoking ruins only to find tendrils of gas creeping over the front, soon to smother their positions. The 8th and the 15th Battalions took the full brunt of the gas. The soldiers in the flank, in Tuxford's 5th Battalion, as well as those echeloned in rear positions at locality C, also found themselves gagging through constricted lungs. Although less widespread than the first chlorine attack, this 1,000-meter long wall of lethal chemicals was also denser, with some wispy fumes rising up to 15 meters. Major Harold Matthews of the 8th Battalion wrote, "It is impossible for me to give a real idea of the terror and horror spread among us by this filthy, loathsome pestilence. The soldiers had suspected that they might encounter gas again after its devastating first use, and word had already been passed down the line that the gas used 2 days earlier had been chlorine, identified by men with backgrounds in chemistry or soldiers who almost daily encountered the strong smell of chlorinated water in making their tea. One fellow of note, George Naismith, the head of the field laboratory for the Canadian Expeditionary Force, advised a Canadian field ambulance officer, Captain Francis Scrimger, to pass the order to use urine to counteract the gas. When the second cloud was unleashed, soldiers were frantically ordered to wet a cloth bandage with water or urine and hold it against mouth and nose as an ad hoc respirator. These improvised devices kept many of the men from suffocating, but the insidious gas killed the skittish, the uninformed, and the weak, who could not muster the will to perform such unpleasant acts of self-preservation. As the heavier-than-air gas rolled over the Canadian lines, it seeped into and filled every crater and shell hole. T.S. Morrissey observed, "The chlorine was heavy, and it lay in the trench, and the boys were smothered to death." Those Canadians already wounded by shrapnel or bullets had been bandaged and placed at the bottom of the trenches or dugouts, awaiting stretcher services to transport them to clearing stations in the rear. With the poison pooling in the low-lying areas, these men suffered heavily. John A. Beaton, then stationed at locality C, with the last remaining company of the 7th Battalion, still under Brigadier Curry's command, wrote in a letter to his father following the battle, "It was the poisonous gases that killed a lot of our poor fellows. They did not have a chance to fight." Those who were standing and firing, with their rags and pads over their mouths, were generally able to keep above the suffocating vapors of gas once the cloud had moved past them, but the chlorine clung to some trenches for 2 hours, dispatching all those who could not get out. However, even those who had stood above the trenches, avoiding gas at the peril of being shot by small arms fire, were affected, and a wetted cloth was a poor shield against lung-searing gas. Infantrymen with streaming eyes fought the urge to rip away their paltry protections as they felt themselves suffocating. An official account from the 15th Battalion reported that men complained of the effect of having cotton batton in one's lungs. Some died, and the remainder were practically useless. Another post-battle report noted that at least 33 15th Battalion men had been killed by gas, and many more who had suffered such deaths likely went uncounted. These gas fatalities contributed to the battalion's staggering 675 casualties, most of which occurred on April 24th. This was the worst one-day loss suffered by a Canadian battalion in the entire war. Yet, most of the Canadians survived the gas, even if many were knocked unconscious or rendered insensible, or were to suffer from damaged lungs for the rest of their chemically shortened lives. Ashen-faced from oxygen deprivation, choking and puking soldiers fired at the shadowy figures following the death cloud. The spike-helmeted infantrymen of the 2nd Reserve Ersatz Brigade advanced tentatively behind their own gas cloud, staying far back from its terrifying outer edges. They marched slowly and cautiously betraying their faith in the gas by advancing in 4 columns of tightly packed men. Few seemed worried about being exposed in the open, since they expected to encounter nothing but corpses. Instead, they moved face first into heavy small arms fire. The Canadians' Ross rifles fired 174 grain .303 caliber bullets that traveled roughly 730 meters per second. The force of the round bowled over advancing troops and tore apart flesh and bone. Added to the Canadian troops' massed rifle fire, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Lipset of the 8th Battalion had arranged for an SOS artillery barrage from the 2nd Field Artillery Brigade to land in front of his lines in case of attack. Within minutes, the bodies of the German dead lay in piles. The wounded writhed in agony. But the defenders, still reeling from the gas, took little pity. Despite this tenacious defense, the weight of German artillery fire and forces was too heavy for the gas troops. On the 15th Battalion's front, from the 3rd Brigade's artillery batteries were in the western front of the salient, situated around the GHQ line, and helping to defend against the German onslaught there. That left the gas Highlanders with little artillery support, and within an hour the left side of the 15th Battalion gave way under the strain. Even their commander, Lieutenant Colonel John A. Curry, lost his grip. Gassed, exhausted, and having seen his men shot to bits, he snapped and deserted from the front. He was found in a rear dugout, insensible, perhaps drunk, and definitely shell-shocked. But not all of the Red Watch, the 15th Battalion, men were broken. C Company held its ground, with pockets of infantrymen fighting it out as German troops overran their position on both sides, and until most of their ammunition was used. The company was annihilated or captured almost to a man. By around 6:30 a.m., the enemy had surged through the 15th Battalion's front and was streaming towards locality C and St. Julien, a little further to the west. The 13th Battalion remained on the left, still stalwartly holding its lines, after being reinforced by 3 companies of the 14th Battalion, who were in a dangerously exposed position with Germans on all 3 sides. The 14th Battalion seemed not to have enjoyed the confidence of General Alderson because of some disciplinary problems they had suffered in England, and perhaps, some thought, because the battalion had a French-Canadian company. But they performed like combat veterans at this point and throughout the battle. These 7 companies of the 13th and 14th Battalions had been shelled all night and day, and had suffered hundreds of casualties due to the weak sandbag breastwork built up from the trenches, which could not impede a high-velocity bullet round. Despite their poor positions, however, the 2 battalions beat back a series of attacks, and even conducted a fighting retreat once they were in danger of being cut off by German troops who poured through the 15th Battalion's now broken flank. But many of the 13th and 14th Battalion men were cut down as they retreated, and others were captured after sacrificing themselves to save their friends. One of the 14th Battalion's men to be killed at this point in the battle was Private C.D.B. Whitby, a journalist for the Montreal Star, who had started a regimental newspaper on the voyage across the Atlantic. His journalistic offering had enjoyed so much success that he had been made the unofficial historian of the battalion. He was lost in the smoke and confusion of the vicious firefight, as was his draft history, which he had been compiling since arriving in England. The battle thus killed not only men, but their history too. The Germans advanced through the narrow gap between the 13th and 14th on the left, and what was left of the 15th on the right. Their target was locality C atop Gravenstafel Ridge. This position was garrisoned by only one company of the 7th Battalion, but its commander, John Worden, a 41-year-old veteran of the Spanish-American and South African Wars, was a legendary fighter who would go on to command a battalion. The Germans were streaming through the lines, but Worden's men, ulcered by small groups of the gasping, choking Highlanders who had rallied at locality C, punished the Germans and forced them to ground. At several points in the day, the Germans attempted to advance on the Canadians, and in desperation, even tried the tactic of wearing the uniforms of captured British soldiers. They nearly made it to the Canadian lines before Worden spotted the strange sight of British troops, some covered in blood, emerging from the direction of the enemy lines. He ordered his troops to open fire. A fellow officer countermanded the order, horrified at shooting British troops. Worden bellowed the order again. Trusting their commander, the rank and file opened fire, and the Germans in British uniforms were shot to pieces. The enemy spent the rest of the day bombarding locality C. Corporal A. McKay wrote in his diary that it was hell all day. He didn't have time to write more, and not much more was left to say. By noon on April 24th, most of the Canadian battalions had been shattered into company and platoon level units, which are now largely unconnected to their battalion headquarters. Locality C and St. Julien remained strong points along the now collapsed salient, with a number of companies, both British and Canadian, spread out between them to help link the battle groups. Command and control had broken down. However, the 13th and 14th battalions still held their overextended front on the left, and the 8th and 5th still clung on tenaciously on the right, even though both had been forced to turn their flanks to meet German troops infiltrating past them. In fact, some platoons and sections were dug in to create all-round defenses, as units were being attacked from all sides. The Canadian Division's headquarters were still several kilometers in the rear and slow to receive information from the front, when information arrived at all. It was often already inaccurate and sometimes contradicted by ever-changing events. The responsibility, therefore, fell to the two brigadiers, Turner and Curry. The third brigadier, Mercer, was largely left out of battle, since he was in reserve when it started, and his units were sent into the line piecemeal without him at command. The battalion and even company commanders had to issue the orders and react to the constantly shifting and dangerous circumstances. Communication between the battalion and brigade levels was spotty at best. The Germans had pushed into the Canadian lines in several places, so no continuous trench system linking the positions remained, and most telephone lines had been cut under the artillery bombardments. The use of flags and lamps to convey messages attracted sniper fire and quickly proved useless over the wide battlefield that was often covered in smoke and dust. Runners were called on to brave sniper fire so that the officers could keep in contact, but too often they never returned from their desperate missions. As no other way to determine the fluid situation was available, a battalion commander would often grab a trusted subordinate to accompany him and run, bent over, across the open fields in an attempt to coordinate the defense. With the Germans pushing on several fronts and reserves used up, the situation was desperate. Pockets of defenders surrendered, but often only after they were wounded, ammunition was spent, or their Ross rifles had jammed. Others were, in Turner's words, blown out of position after position. On the left flank of Turner's front, the situation went from bad to worse on April 24th. Turner's headquarters at Mousetrap Farm was bombarded throughout the day. Bleeding, moaning soldiers were lying on the floor of Turner's headquarters, and bullets would periodically pass through the weak sandbag defenses that had been piled up against the walls. At one point, a Dutch shell crashed through the roof, landing on the floor and leaving the house rocking like a boat. Amid this chaos, Turner was dealing with both frantic messages emanating from the frontline units and demands for information coming from the rear. Turner's own communications were often cut, and the runners he sent out disappeared in a hail of shrapnel and rifle fire. At the front, the 2nd, 3rd, 10th, and 16th battalions were engaged in continuous and fierce firefights, and extricating them from their ongoing battles was proving difficult. The enemy was also finding the seams in the Canadian defense by pushing into the rear areas, cutting off forward units, and leaving those in the rear without a clear appreciation of the unfolding battle. Senior Divisional Staff Officer, Lieutenant Colonel G.C. Gordon Hall, noted that Turner's brigade headquarters lost control of his battalions during the critical hours of the fight. The situation would get worse. With only intermittent communications, the exhausted, slightly gassed, and increasingly shell-shocked Turner misunderstood orders from divisional headquarters at 1 p.m. to strengthen the present line and hold on. Instead, 40 minutes later, he ordered the retirement of all his troops to the GHQ line. In the confusion of the fighting, with orders late or never arriving, Turner must have thought that his front was untenable. But he was not panicking. One runner noted that while he was at Turner's headquarters, he saw the exhausted general writing a message when a shell burst a few feet away. "Pretty close," remarked Turner, without looking up. The runner jotted down in his diary, "Nerve of that sort helped me a great deal." However, despite his personal bravery and inspiring stoicism under fire, Turner's serious tactical error in ordering his battalions to fall back to the GHQ line, resulting from either a misinterpretation of the divisional order or his desire to take matters into his own hands, could have resulted in the annihilation of the entire Canadian division. Only an exhausted and gassed man could have put faith in the GHQ line, which was far too glamorous a name for what was little more than a shallow ditch, partly facing the wrong way, and easily enfiladed by enemy fire. Unfortunately, the move only crammed troops into a nearly defenseless trench and made them easier victims of shell fire. The existing trench system consisted mostly of shallow trenches and pits, which offered protection to individuals, but not to large units. The GHQ line was a far easier target to observe and hit than the positions the Canadians had spent the last 2 days and nights fortifying. Even worse, the GHQ line ran northeast to southwest, the wrong direction from which to defend against units from the north of the salient. The line was likely the worst spot to hold, with massed troops in the northern part of the Ypres salient, through Canadian Divisional Headquarters, though Canadian Divisional Engineers worked feverishly to strengthen it with sandbags and deeper trenches. The fortifiers succeeded under heavy shell fire, and their actions likely saved hundreds of lives. Many front-line officers must have shaken their heads in disbelief when Turner's order reached them at around mid-afternoon on April 24th. A few officers asked for a confirmation order, as they thought it was some sort of German ruse. Sadly, it was not. But to follow the order would be nearly impossible, since all along the front the infantry was engaged with the enemy, some as little as only 25 meters from opposing forces. How were these men to stop firing, jump out of their trenches, and run several hundred meters to the rear? It would be a turkey shoot. Those defenders still alive with the 13th Battalion, after about 60 hours of fighting, for instance, would have more than 1.5 kilometers to travel over open ground and in broad daylight. But they had to follow orders, and at this point no single battalion commander, or anyone below him in rank for that matter, had any idea as to what was happening along the front. Perhaps the whole salient was about to be cut off. Perhaps Curry's brigade had fallen during the second gas attack. Whatever the case, Turner's men would follow their orders, as those in the front lines prepared for their fighting retreat. Grieving comrades were forced to leave many of the wounded behind. Others picked up buddies and tried to carry them, making them slow-moving targets. The enemy snipers and machine gunners swept the open ground with fire as the Canadians ran across it in broad daylight. Pockets of resistors, sections and half-sections, sacrificed themselves to hold off the enemy with all remaining ammunition, so that their retreating friends might have a chance to survive. Lieutenant Edward Bellew, a third-generation soldier, before retiring from the 18th Royal Irish Regiment to work as a harbour construction engineer in New Westminster, British Columbia, had been appointed machine gun officer for the 7th Battalion. With the Germans closing in, he almost single-handedly allowed for dozens of his companions to retreat, as the 7th Battalion still held critical ground at Kearslayer on Turner's front. He and his loader kept up a deadly arc of fire from their Colt machine gun, and even though he was cut off by enemy troops working behind him, and then wounded, he kept firing. With his comrade killed beside him, Belleau finally used up all of his ammunition, but he still had the presence of mind, despite his injuries and with the Germans closing in on him, to destroy his gun. And, instead of surrendering, he picked up a rifle and bayonet and charged the enemy. Somehow he survived, but remained a prisoner of war until 1919. The British government kept the award of his Victoria Cross secret until his release, fearing that he would be treated harshly in the prisoner of war camp, or that the Germans would brag about his incarceration. Many of the Canadian units on this front reacted badly to Turner's seemingly suicidal order. An angry Lieutenant Colonel Watson of the 2nd Battalion at first ignored the order, informing Turner's headquarters that he could hold on, and had already destroyed several enemy attacks. But Turner's headquarters would allow no opposition, and again ordered a retreat. Watson tried to organize a fighting force composed of companies retreating in staggered, measured bounds, which involved retreating a short distance, going to ground, firing at the enemy to allow other units to retreat, and then retreating again. Discipline and training allowed the 2nd Battalion and other Canadian units caught in the same dilemma to retreat in the face of such pressure. But later, in an official report, Watson informed Turner and the brigadier's superiors at divisional headquarters that it was during this retirement that we sustained our heaviest losses in the entire battle. With the remnants of several battalions now holding the new GHQ position, their location attracted artillery fire, which caused further casualties as the disheveled infantry tried to dig into the earth to escape its fury. As damaging as this action was to the units under Turner's command, it had equally serious implications for Currie's forces on the far right. This pullback from the rubble of what had been St. Julien and the surrounding area created a wide gap of 3,000 meters between the two forward brigades, leaving Currie's flank dangerously exposed. Upon realizing that the forces on his left had disappeared and would soon be replaced by German troops, Currie sent several urgent requests to Turner and his good friend Garnet Hughes to return their forces to the original line. His first communiques went unanswered, and subsequent ones elicited only short statements that the 3rd Brigade had no men to spare. A post-war assessment by Canadian official historian A.F. Duguid privately condemned Turner's actions and noted that if the Germans had exploited the gap, they might have cut off all the troops in the eastern and southern fronts of the salient. With no units available to Currie to cover Turner's grievous tactical error, the 2nd Brigade was in a desperate situation. He had no reserves left to plug the gap. At the front, the 5th and 8th Battalions, as well as the motley force at Locality C, were still beating back German attacks, suffering under overwhelmingly heavy shell fire and the aftermath of the gas attack. Currie could take no men from there without weakening this critical anchor. Aware that his forward force would soon be decapitated, Currie prepared to pull back the remaining Canadian battalions to Locality C on Gravenstaffel Ridge. In the firing line, the fighting was nearly non-stop. Sergeant William Alexander Aldrich of the 8th Battalion, a 33-year-old former physical director for the YMCA, had been firing his Colt machine gun for nearly 3 days straight, stopping only when the ammunition ran out or the barrel glowed red hot. He wrote his final diary entry on April 24th, during one of the short lulls in the pressure. Germans massing. Frith dead. Eccles dead. Robertson and Roberts and Burns of my gun team killed, and Hamilton, Flower, wounded. Relief did not arrive, but reinforcements did. Nearly all of the 3rd Brigade wiped out, and both the other brigades lost heavily. Aldrich's position was overrun in wave attacks, and he was captured on the battlefield. In a twist of fate, his mud-stained diary was found by German soldier Richard Hilbert of Dittersdorf, who later forwarded it to Aldrich's family in Winnipeg. It was a tangible legacy of their son's service. Even as he languished in a German prison, Aldrich did not return home until the summer of 1919, almost a full 5 years after he left Canada, and he died at the young age of 52, his constitution weakened permanently from his harsh incarceration. Pressure was felt all along the front. The Canadians had suffered staggering casualties, the 1st and 2nd lethal gas attacks in the history of warfare, and rifles that did not work, all the while being vastly outnumbered by conventional enemy forces. Yet, key strongpoints of defenders were holding out, drawing upon hidden reserves of willpower and endurance, making the Germans pay for every advance. At the feet of blood-stained infantrymen, still firing, lay the bodies of the wounded and slain. Most of the survivors had bullet holes through tunics and caps, their water bottles and pieces of kit blown away by shrapnel. Almost everyone left alive and still fighting had missed death or maiming by mere inches. Yet they fought on. If only a few reinforcements could be brought forward to stem the tide, the Canadian front might still hold. What was maddening to Currie was that at least 2 British battalions were languishing at the GHQ line, preparing for a counterattack to stabilize Turner's front. The attack was cancelled by early afternoon, but still the British refused to move to support Currie and his overextended men. Having appraised the desperate situation, Currie made the controversial decision to leave his troops and go to the rear to seek out a senior British officer and gain control of these yet uncommitted units. If he did not get reinforcements, he would be forced to pull back, exposing British units on his right flank. He had warned the British of this, but still the High Command had not reacted. Again, the delay in transmitting and receiving information hampered the fighting men. While Currie knew that a brigadier's place was not to go running around the battlefield, his battalion commanders had better control over the ever-changing situation than he or his staff. He instructed them to fight it out or retreat to stronger lines, depending on the circumstances. G.S. Tuxford of the 5th and L.J. Lipset of the 8th worked together to ensure that, in the case of a fighting retreat, the Germans did not wedge them apart. G.S. Tuxford said, "Our losses were exceptionally heavy. We were short of SAA, small arms ammunition. We were gassed. We were without rations and but little water. We had been promised help, which they either would not or could not give us, and for which we felt justly aggrieved." Seemingly abandoned by the troops behind them. It fell to the battalions and companies of the 2nd Brigade to fight it out on their own. They beat back at least 5 frontal attacks during this day. Currie realized that only a personal appeal from himself would convince the British to commit further troops, and he resolved to make the trip and impress on them the difficult conditions at the front. Advancing back through heavy artillery fire at around 3 p.m., the grim-faced Currie, whose hair was always dapperly parted in the middle, but was now a sweaty mess from his alternately running through artillery bombardments and diving into shell craters, reached the headquarters of Major General Thomas Snow of the 27th Division. Snow had a well-deserved reputation as the rudest man in the British Army. He seems to have particularly disliked the Canadians and had no sympathy for their plight. In fact, he thought them incompetent. Forget the gas or the overwhelming attacks. Forget the desperate yet successful counterattacks. Forget the fact that Currie's front was now entirely unhinged because of Turner's retreat. Snow refused to consider how to help the Canadians, taking the brunt of the fighting. A disheveled Currie, eyes bloodshot from the gas, no doubt confirmed every prejudice already carried by Snow. Without any time to collect his thoughts, Currie tersely and professionally reported the situation and asked for reserve units. But the British general would have none of it, belittling Currie's unorthodox action of coming to the rear in person, questioning whether the colonial had lost his nerve and abandoned his troops. While Currie must have seemed dispirited as a result of the prolonged fighting and almost 3 days without sleep, he in fact had a firm understanding of the desperate situation. After he again calmly reiterated the situation, Snow boorishly cut him off, screaming, "Have you come to teach me my profession and dictate to me how I handle my division?" Currie bit his tongue, especially since Snow's only encouragement was to return to the front and give them hell. Currie later noted rightly that Snow's admonition was the most stupid remark he had ever heard. Currie kept his cool and soon left the dugout, realizing that he was on his own. Major C.H. Mitchell from the Canadian Division headquarters ran into Currie after the fiery meeting and remarked on the brigadier's steely resolve to fight it out to the end. Indeed, it appears that Snow, having thoroughly misinterpreted the situation at the front, was the one in desperate need of arrest. Further, attesting to Snow's unhinged state, he did in fact release 5 British divisions to fill the gap between Currie and Turner, but maliciously did not bother to tell Currie. A discouraged Currie left, assuming he had failed to convince Snow to release his reserves. However, on his way back to the front, Currie picked up some stragglers in the rear, about 200 men, many suffering from gas poisoning, and led them in a well-disciplined march back into the mouth of hell. Along the way, Currie must have wondered if the British had decided to sacrifice his force in the hope of saving the salient. Currie's unconventional action had done little to stabilize the front, but it had been the correct path. On this occasion, the former land developer revealed tactical flexibility and open-mindedness that would shine forth further as the war progressed. Yet, Even Currie had lost control of his forces at times in the battle, and had been engaged in a shocking shouting match with one of his junior officers, betraying the pressure under which he and all the officers labored. In contrast to Currie, Turner had reacted poorly to the friction and confusion of battle, and his effective abandonment of St. Julien and Currie's brigade on the far right should have resulted in his being fired. Later, on April 24th, Turner also went to divisional headquarters to find more troops, as his men were nearly played out. Instead of offering sympathy for the 3rd Brigade's 3 days of continuous warfare, Alderson was dismayed to learn that Turner's men were on the GHQ line, and ordered him back to protect Currie's flank. Turner refused, calling it suicide, and at this stage it was. Neither man understood the other's position, and bad feelings developed between the exhausted and frazzled generals. Alderson considered relieving Turner of his duties, but he had no one with whom to replace him. He also realized that the Canadian government might condemn him, or even demand his resignation, if he sacked a Victoria Cross winning hero who had held out through 3 days of brutal warfare. A steaming Turner returned to the GHQ line and bravely rallied his men for one last defense. On the right flank, with British counterattacks abandoned in the early part of the day, the Germans launched another major operation during the mid-afternoon. Under a withering artillery barrage, Currie's forces at locality C again held off the German infantry. It was another desperate stand against overwhelming odds, and although the Canadians were outnumbered and outgunned, they refused to break. Dozens, however, were cut down. A desperate Private Samuel Archer wrote, "I should not call this war. It is slaughter. I crawled half a mile to get my wounds dressed. The shells were bursting all around me, and bullets coming in all directions over my head, while the dead were lying everywhere. No matter where you went, you could see nothing but dead bodies." Escaping the charnel house was a relief for Archer, but the ever-thinning ranks of the Canadians could not hold on for much longer, although they were ably supported by Canadian field guns that had moved forward into range and saturated the enemy front with high explosives and shrapnel. But the entire Canadian division, or what was left of it, was in great danger of being split in two by the German advance, which now held St. Julien. With German and Canadian forces jutting into each other's lines, utter confusion reigned over the battlefield as soldiers were shot from all directions. But the situation did not last long. Late in the day, a British counterattack by Snow's 5 battalions drove the Germans back along the front, especially those in the gap between the 2nd and 3rd Brigades, allowing time for Currie to extricate his forces from the now overextended and dangerously vulnerable position. Even though the Germans continued to outnumber the British and Canadian troops, they had been fought to a standstill, but it had cost another day of blood and sacrifice, and post-war forensic historians would determine that a shocking 3,058 Canadians were wounded, captured, and killed on April 24th alone. Sergeant William Miller wrote, "Imagine hell in its worst form. You might have a slight idea what it was like." A reputation forged. Brigadier Arthur Currie declared to his troops, "We must hang on." The tenacity of most Canadian infantrymen was never in doubt, even though they had suffered crippling casualties. Throughout April 25th, exhausted and battered beyond recognition, they continued to endure shell fire and repel attacks. German officer Rudolf Binding, who fought in one of the forward assault battalions, described the condition of the stubborn Canadian defenders who sacrificed their lives to hold the line. A sleeping army lies in front of one of our brigades. They rest in good order, man by man, and will never wake again. Canadian divisions. The enemy's losses are enormous. With British and French reinforcements finally arriving in larger numbers on the fourth day of the battle, the remains of Canadian battalions were systematically relieved throughout April 25th. Before this relief arrived, however, several Canadian units, especially what was left of 5th, 7th, 8th, and 10th battalions, were driven out of their trenches and finally out of the strong point at locality C. These battalions had retired in the face of enormous pressure, but they did so in disciplined retreats. The remains of platoons and sections supporting one another with concentrated fire. Equally common was the banding together of fragments of former units into informal battle groups after battalions and companies were effectively destroyed by massive casualties to the officer corps and the rank and file. Within this chaos, the Canadians continued to remain an effective fighting force. Perhaps the independent spirit that had got many of the Canadians in trouble in England was revealing itself again on the battlefield. And these now fire-hardened veterans realized that they did not require officers to corral them to fight for their very lives. This tactical improvisation will remain a staple among the Canadian fighting forces for the next 3.5 years of war. In several engagements on April 25th, the pursuing Germans thought the Canadians were routed, but each time they tried to close the gap, they were met with heavy rifle fire. These were the final enemy pushes against the Canadians, most of whom were relieved by the end of the day. Survivors dragged themselves to the rear, exhausted after going for about 85 hours without sleep, and almost as long without adequate water and food. Many of the men suffered terribly, hacking through gassed lungs, while others stared blankly, faces covered with days of stubble, black from sweat and dirt, bloodshot eyes revealing unspoken horrors. 29-year-old Private Percy Kingsley of Humboldt, Saskatchewan wrote, "Our losses were terrible, and the sights I saw I shall never forget." Some of the survivors never recovered from their ordeal and were sent home, either with shattered minds or corrupted lungs. The 1,410 captured as prisoners would begin a new punishing war of survival behind barbed wire. Almost half of the prisoners had been wounded, and 87 would die of their wounds in captivity. Frederick Fraser of the 8th Battalion wrote, "While I lay wounded in a makeshift hospital, the position was captured and the enemy infantry bayoneted all the Canadian prisoners who could not walk to the rear." But not all captured men were brutalized. Lieutenant Clyde Scott had been shot and left for dead, his near lifeless body thrown on a pile of corpses. Back home, his parents were informed of his death and held a memorial service in Perth, Ontario, his mother receiving a Silver Cross medal to mark her son's sacrifice. But a curious dog found him and the heap of bodies, and a sympathetic German soldier carried him to a doctor, where he was subsequently operated on and saved. Although crippled for life, he would return home, marry, and have a daughter, Barbara Ann, a future Olympic gold medal skater. Engaged in fighting retreats across the front, many Canadians felt guilty about leaving behind the wounded, and more than a few believed that they had abandoned men to execution. Others volunteered to act as a hopeless rearguard force to enable their companions to survive. Private G.D. Scott of the 7th Battalion had been part of one such small reserve force that went into combat on April 24th. It was like throwing a cup of water on a burning house, for our two sections amounted to 28 men in all. During the fighting, Scott was wounded in the side, and many of his friends were killed around him. Their surviving officer used a bloody bandage as a white flag. Only 10 men were left alive at the time of their surrender. For this little group of dazed and stupefied survivors, the fighting was over, but captivity would last another 24 months. While some captured Canadians were undoubtedly killed on the battlefield, most were taken prisoner and survived their harrowing trip to the enemy's rear. The most influential atrocity story at the time was the supposed crucifixion of a Canadian soldier to a barn door, bayonets through hands and feet. The story became a powerful legend, and while many Canadians claimed to have seen the crucified Canadian, all told different versions of what had happened. Investigators were later unable to find corroborating stories, and many witnesses recanted under interrogation, admitting that they had not actually seen the crucified soldier, but had been told about him by trusted sources. Where this supposed crucifixion would have taken place, especially since the Canadian lines constricted during the battle, thus leaving all witnesses presumably behind German lines, bothered few survivors in retelling the story with much venom. The Christ-like image of the executed Canadian reinforced the importance of crusading against such an inhumane enemy. The story struck a chord, being widely believed in the Canadian forces and passed on to reinforcements. It was also employed as a justification by some to show no mercy to the Hun in future battles. Barlow Whiteside, a graduate of McGill University, opined, "The only way to deal with such a German foe that used poison gas to exterminate men and that crucified prisoners was to exterminate them." The savagery of battle was a terrible shock for the infantrymen who took the brunt of the fighting. One survivor wrote, "I have often wanted to see a fight, and now I have done so. I don't want to see any more. I think of all the awful sights, of all the dead and dying lying all about in contorted shapes. That sight, combined with the cries of the wounded during the night, I shall never forget." Some simply could not believe that they had survived. John Matheson wrote home to Medicine Hat, Alberta, "With the exception of being hit by a rifle bullet on the cheek and a piece of shrapnel in the side, I am still for it. I have bullet holes in my hat, equipment, and clothes, but evidently I am slated to do some more evil in this world yet." Many of the hard men who had withstood the horror of war wept openly when roll call was sounded off after the battle, the voices of sergeants and lieutenants cracking as name after name was called out, and met only with silence. In less than a week, the first major Canadian battle claimed half of the infantrymen who had trained together for more than 6 months. Lieutenant Colonel George Tuxford wrote, "During those 4 days of relentless fighting, the infantry battalions had held on with nothing more than a handful of disorganized men, sticking it out, having practically no orders, out of touch, and not knowing anything about the situation, nor knowing what to do so or where to go, and ready to attach themselves to any definite authority that turned up." When the Second Battle of Ypres degenerated into hundreds of miniature battles, the Canadians kept fighting, long past the endurance point, in ad hoc combat groups that were sometimes a few dozen men and sometimes only a few friends watching each other's back. Despite some awkward failures to properly situate the artillery to support the infantry, the gunners had provided devastating defensive fire on April 23rd and 24th, often shattering enemy counterattacks. The 18 guns of the 2nd Canadian Field Artillery Brigade had fired about 12,000 rounds on the second and third day of the battle, monumental figures by the standards of 1915. The drivers, horses, and mules that hauled ammunition forward throughout the battle had also played an essential, if forgotten, role in ensuring that the Canadians were not overrun for lack of ammunition. Although most of the Canadian units had performed beyond all expectations, mistakes had been made. Both Currie and Turner were fortunate not to have been part of a British division, as Turner's miscalculation in pulling back his troops and Currie's unorthodox action of leaving his troops and going to the British headquarters himself would likely have resulted in their dismissal. Indeed, Alderson did consider removing Turner from command, but felt that his political connections were too strong. Yet Alderson, too, had shown little brilliance. While communication to his divisional headquarters was cut repeatedly, and he sent forward officers to determine what was happening, the desperate situation surely demanded that he move parts or all of his divisional command forward to lessen the distance from front to rear. J.S. Buster Brown, a staff officer during the war and often remembered for planning a possible invasion of the United States in the 1920s, wrote, "I firmly believe that we should not conceal any defects, for we have every right to have defects at that time." Instead of finding scapegoats, however, Alderson turned his attention to the heavy losses of men and officers, and focused on rebuilding the combat effectiveness of units with reinforcements from England. Although failures had occurred during the battle, these should in no way overshadow the resilient Canadian defense against nearly overwhelming odds. The inexperienced Canadian troops, who had only recently apprenticed with the British, had shown their mettle in the cauldron of fire and gas. And, while the Germans had never planned to push on to the Channel ports, they might have been able to envelop the 50,000 Entente troops in the salient if the Canadians had not held firm. Such a result would have been a disaster of monumental proportions, and the War Office did not exaggerate its praise when it announced, "The Canadians had many casualties, but their gallantry and determination undoubtedly saved the situation." Further, more than a few Germans spoke grudgingly of the tenacious determination of the Dominion troops. Undeniably, the division's first battle had been a bloody one, but the Canadians had earned a name for themselves as unyielding soldiers. The second Ypres survivors carried the honor of their outstanding performance in the battle like a badge. The level of Canadian casualties had been shocking, at more than 6,000, almost evenly divided among the three infantry brigades, and a few hundred more from the artillery and the units along the lines of communications. In the front lines, the Canadians lost almost 50% of their infantry strength. Poison gas had shocked, frightened, and angered the Entente forces, but conventional weapons, small arms fire, high explosives, and shrapnel killed in far greater numbers. The 15th Battalion was devastated, losing about 675 men, effectively destroying it. The 2nd lost 541 men. The 7th lost 580 men. 5 other battalions suffered more than 400 casualties. No battalion suffered less than 250 casualties. 3 Canadian battalion commanders had been killed while leading from the front, and the 4th, Lieutenant Colonel John Curry of the 15th Battalion, was sent home. The remaining 10 survivors would rise through the ranks. Every officer who became divisional commander in the coming 4 years had fought through the Second Battle of Ypres. In fact, so too had most of the brigadiers. At lower levels, many junior officers and NCOs who had survived the fighting would rise to command battalions. Over the next 3.5 years of battle, 2nd Ypres veterans would go on to fill most of the senior command positions in the Canadian Corps. While much of the recognition and glory in the battle went to the commanding officers, as well as some derision to Turner and Curry, the credit for the Canadians' victory, or perhaps more accurately, their absence of defeat, must go to the infantry. Time and time again, it had been the infantry in the front lines, fighting it out against overwhelming odds, often pressured from 2 or 3 sides, and dealing with a host of problems, from poor command to lack of food and water, from chlorine gas to jammed Ross rifles. It had been the infantry, those men who many Imperials felt did not have the discipline or the military skills to yet survive on the battlefield, who had shown unshakable resilience in keeping the enemy from cutting off the salient and dealing a crushing blow to the Entente war effort. Success at Ypres had not been a result of commanders' actions, but of those of the soldiers in the firing line. After the first day, it had fallen to the junior officers, the majors, captains, and lieutenants, to direct the shifting, confusing defense that often had to be improvised on the spot. Command further devolved to senior non-commissioned officers, and both NCOs and officers depended on resolute bands of privates holding out against impossible odds. The Canadians learned very early in their war service that control could not be exerted through the lieutenant colonels or brigadiers, and that junior officers would need to be empowered to command from the front, as they were the only ones who could direct the battle when all communication was cut from front to rear. This was a hard lesson to accept in the hierarchical context of the army, but a necessary one if formations were to remain effective on the Western Front after heavy casualties. The British and French continued to fight in the salient on and off until May 25th. The British lost about 60,000 men, and the Germans admitted to 34,873 casualties, although likely another 8,000 or so lightly wounded German soldiers were not counted. This was one of the few points during the war where the defenders lost more than the attackers. Although this unusual loss rate could no doubt be attributed to the unleashing of half a dozen additional gas attacks and the overwhelming German artillery fire. Rudimentary respirators and concentrated defensive artillery fire ensured that the British forces blunted these chemical attacks, but they had paid a harsh price. While this chemical frightfulness did not live up to the claims by some hysterics during the dark days after April 22nd that gas would be a war-winning weapon, gas would be used increasingly by all armies in the coming years of war, reaching a saturation point in the last 18 months of combat, during which every battlefield on the Western Front was blanketed in chemicals, and soldiers were forced to fight through the only continuous gas environment in the history of warfare. In the northern salient, the casualty rates had spiked from the first minutes of the battle, then throughout the day, and then day after day. First, the French and Algerians, then the Canadians, then the British were brought in on bloody stretchers in the arms of comrades or dragging themselves back on shattered limbs. The stretcher bearers and orderlies tried to care for the wounded and apply rough bandages, but hundreds of wounded, bloodied men needed emergency battlefield surgery. Arms red in blood, John McCrae, the medical officer of the 1st Brigade Canadian Field Artillery, recounted it as 17 days of Hades. In a brief respite from the cries of pain and grisly work among shattered bones and lacerated flesh, and moved by the death of his friend Alexis Helmer, McCrae sat outside his dugout and scratched a 15-line poem in almost as many minutes, and so was penned the most memorable poem of the war, and part of every proper commemoration ceremony for the fallen of wars since then. In Flanders fields, the poppies blow between the crosses row on row that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, short days ago. We lived, felt dawn, saw a sunset glow. Loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. The Canadian Division had suffered a terrible blow, and the shock of war was more difficult to fathom at home. We took great pride in the stalwart defense, and were then blindsided by the row upon row of the names of the dead and wounded. Despite the overwhelming enemy guns, troops, and use of chemical weapons, the Canadians had fought on, refusing to be broken. And they would continue the fight, as McCrae demanded. They would not break faith with those who were killed in the Ypres salient.